Okay, so world building. So when you're talking about world building, when we talk about world building in fantasy and science fiction, it's not just about creating planets and different worlds and kingdoms that you just kind of have just sort of like that are fantastical. That's just sort of naming places. If you're trying to create different worlds like a planet or something, you see a lot of authors, they'll create something, a world, let's say it's a planet that's always on, like really hot, like a desert world or something, and they just kind of give it a name. And a lot of people call that, well, that's world building, right? You're creating the world. But that's not really world building at all. That's just sort of naming places. Anybody can do that. Okay, so what world building is really at its core, there's a few things to remember, but the core thing to remember about world building is that you're trying to integrate the world that you create with your characters and your characters' actions. So that, for instance, if you have that planet, that's always hot, it's always on fire. Well, it's actually not accomplishing much in the story if the character isn't somehow affected by that specific environment. So if it's, I'll give you an example. In The Empire Strikes Back, Luke is on a snow planet. Now it doesn't really affect the plot much until he's being first taken by a monster, right, kidnapped, then he escapes an ice cave, then he is suffering hypothermia and goes unconscious, and because he does, he sees a vision of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Han Solo comes up, and if it's not for Han cutting open the belly of this animal called the Tauntaun, Luke would die. He needed somehow to stay alive. You see, the planet, the environment, the fantasy environment that they've put Luke in, is having an effect directly on Luke. Otherwise, it could be taking place anywhere. So what you'll see is a lot of, like, say, maybe in the recent Star Wars films, when they're on these planets, they could be on any planet for all we care and for all they care. The planets aren't really having an effect the way that, say, Arrakis has in the series of Dune. If or the way that the Hoth, like I said, has an effect on Luke in The Empire Strikes Back. So there are three main things you can do, to help your story actually be fleshed out through setting. It's what world building really is. You're trying to establish your world through setting. And there's three main things you can do. First one is, I've just said, integrate the character into the world and vice versa. Have the world affect your character, and have your character have some kind of sizable, measurable interactions with the world and affect the world and help it evolve and change. Two, the unique setting must be unique enough that it matters that the story is taking place in a fantasy or sci-fi story. Otherwise, it could be taking place anywhere. So why did you set your story on a desert planet, or on a planet where, like a gas giant, or in a fantasy realm where everyone can teleport? Like maybe that's the idea of your story, is everyone can teleport. Well, I mean, is it just for fun, or is it unique enough that it actually matters that your specific story, the theme of it, is the theme of story about privacy? So if that's the theme of your story, privacy, that makes sense. Teleporting, if everyone can just teleport everywhere, well, that would invade a lot of people's privacy. So that makes sense that you've selected that. And I'm being very direct there. It doesn't have to be that. It can be more subtle than that, but it has a reason that you chose that setting for your story. Your story has to be in that setting. It should feel that integrated, that otherwise it could be anywhere. And the last thing is that you need to establish the rules and the boundaries of your world, so that the audience understands the limits and the consequences of the character's actions. There's nothing more, there's nothing that shatters the magic more than when suddenly the character can be doing, like, something that, a power or something that came out of nowhere that we weren't privy to. We didn't know they could do that. Late in the book, or it's okay if it's early and it's trying to be like you're trying to shock the audience, like, oh, okay, that's what's going on in this world. But if you're doing it mid to late in the game, you've already established the boundaries. You can't keep pulling them out unless it's really essential to the plot that surprise comes in late in the game. So again, to kind of go back over them, you have to integrate the characters into the world and vice versa, right? There has to be something. And I'll give you an example for that one. Let's say in that desert world, it's so hot that you have to even go near the planet, your starship has to park in the shadow of a bigger starship that's like got a special hull plating, and that lowers you down to the planet so that you can hide from the sun. So when you land on the planet, you can get to the cities on the planet, but everyone on that planet has to live underground, right? Because the sun is just so hot. And that's great, because why? Because that means that if that shield ship, we'll call it a shield ship, if it's not there, then the person who came down in that shield ship cannot leave the desert planet. They can't leave, because if they leave, they'll be incinerated by the sun. So you've created right there sort of a pressure cooker on that planet. They can't leave. They're stuck in the underground city. They can't leave until the shield ship comes back down. You've given a reason that your story took place on this desert planet. Same thing with The Martian, with Matt Damon. If you've seen that film or read the novel, he's stranded on Mars, and it takes a whole year for the rescue team to wrap around Earth and come back for him. Now, if they had done that on any other storyline, or any kind of setting, like they could have done that on Earth, right? A person stranded in modern times on Earth, and it takes a whole year to get back to them. But if it's on Mars, well, now the story makes sense. You're showing a man being left alone, 90 million miles away. So it makes sense that you created it, and the environment itself, Mars, becomes like an enemy. It's kind of Mars is the villain in The Martian. So that's some ideas there that you guys can use, sort of think about when you're thinking about when you're world building, like what is the point? And the point is to integrate the characters, make the setting unique enough that it actually matters that your story is taking place in a fantasy setting, in a fantasy genre, and then establish the rules and the boundaries of the world so that the audience understands the limits and the consequences of the characters' actions.